Good afternoon. My presentation this afternoon will be on an article taken from Mother Jones Magazine, the May-June issue of 2011, written by Chris Mooney, and the article is entitled "The Science of Why We Don't Believe in Science." The article opens with this quote: "A man with a conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree and he turns away. Show him facts or figures and he questions your sources. Appeal to logic and he fails to see your point." This quote actually comes from a researcher at Stanford University by the name of Leon Festinger, who worked in the 1950s. Now, Leon was interested in how it is that we hold on to beliefs that seem to fly in the face of the facts that are currently confronting us. And so Leon embedded himself in a Chicago area cult known as the Seekers. And this cult had believed that they had made contact with extraterrestrials. And that the extraterrestrials had given them some inside information that there was to be this cataclysmic event that was to destroy the world. And so they had promised to come and rescue this group of individuals, this cult, before that event. And so the cult members bought into this big time. They quit their jobs. They made all the preparations necessary to be ready for this event. The date came that they were supposed to be rescued. That date came and went. There was no rescue. The date for the event itself, the cataclysmic event that was supposed to happen and come and split the continent, and it was supposed to be swallowed by the oceans, and none of that transpired. And so Festinger was with the group at the time, and he was really interested to see how this would all play out. And interestingly enough, they began to rationalize. They came up with this idea that the reason that it did not happen was because they believed so strongly in what the extraterrestrials had told them, that the extraterrestrials had intervened to save the planet. And so Festinger found this fascinating because these individuals, in the wake of this, they had publicized this event and made it known that this was going to happen, and they were the ones that were going to be saved. And in the wake of this, their credibility had been destroyed. Many of them lost their jobs. Some of them lost their families. But yet they clung to this information despite the fact that the facts around them didn't bear it out. They clung to that belief tenaciously. And so the question is, what's going on here? What was happening? And so one of the terms that we apply to this is motivated reasoning. And motivated reasoning is reasoning where we have good reason, at least in our minds, to not accept the facts that we're presented with. We want to hang on to them at any cost. It tends to exist when pre-existing beliefs are more important than the facts around us. And these beliefs can skew our thinking and color our conclusions. It changes the way we look at the world. To make matters worse, what researchers have found out is that our reasoning is suffused with emotion. Our minds are pretty primitive construction in some ways. And so when we're confronted with new facts, one of the things that happens is our emotions kick in first. Our emotions are more primitive in the evolution of our mind than logic and reason. And so they kick in first. And we begin to apply the flight or fight reflex to the data with which we're confronted. Not only do we do it with threats, physical threats to our safety and well-being, but we do it with data that conflicts with what we hold to be true. The reasoning comes later. It kicks in at a later time. It works slower than the emotions do. And unfortunately, the reasoning can also be colored by the emotions. And so even when that reasoning kicks in, those emotions may have already changed how we're thinking about this event. Another interesting way of looking at this is many times when we think about reasoning, what we find is we're not reasoning at all, but what we're doing is we're rationalizing. They have noted that there are two biases that all of us carry within us when it comes to processing new information. One of these is a confirmation bias, and the other one is a disconfirmation bias. The confirmation bias says that we give greater credence to evidence that bolsters our beliefs. We tend to be more readily accepting of information that backs up what we believe, rather than information that causes us to have to rethink the beliefs that we already hold. The disconfirmation bias, on the other hand, says that we'll expend proportional amounts of energy to debunk or refute views that attack our beliefs. We will go through great lengths and jump through great mental hoops to try and keep intact the belief system that we already have. And the author gave two examples of this. We do this a lot of times in our personal lives with very emotional things. For instance, if we have evidence that our spouse is cheating on us, we will go through mental hoops and we will ignore evidence, and we will work very hard to create a mental construct where that reality is not true. The same thing happens with our children. If we are told by the school or by another parent that our child is a bully, we immediately dismiss that because of our love for our child, and we go through and look at the evidence and sort through the evidence in such a way that we just can't believe that's true, even though evidence would suggest otherwise. See, the problem is that what we find out is that we have other goals besides accuracy. And two of the primary goals that affect this are identity affirmation and protecting one's sense of self. These two are very closely related. We don't want to let go of who we are or how we perceive ourselves. And if new information threatens that, then we tend to react emotionally rather than rationally. In an attempt to get beyond all this and to rise above this is the field of science. Science was created to be hard and objective and distance from our emotions and so we can look at things objectively. It's an attempt to move beyond what Francis Bacon called the idols of the mind. And science is really built on two primary principles. The first principle is peer review. It means that other scientists are to look at our information. They are to either verify it or disprove it. But it needs to be looked at multiple times and verified multiple times to make sure that it is indeed correct. The other principle on which science is built is institutional skepticism, which means that it's built into the very nature of science that we're skeptical, that we don't accept things at face value. We have to ask the hard questions, the why and the how. And we have to look beyond just what appear to be the easy surface facts and dig a little deeper and figure what's going on. Now there's a problem with this, with science being built and based on these principles. The problem is that, number one, that it employs a lot of nuance, right? There's a lot of nuanced thinking that goes on in science, and the other situation we have is that it also discloses, by its very nature, all remaining sources of uncertainty. If we have any doubt in the information at all, as good scientists, they're required to disclose that and to make that known. Questions that they still have, information where they're not 100% certain, places where they suspect that it might be, that the information they're reasoning might be flawed. The problem is, this leaves scientific research, particularly to the uninitiated, it leaves it open to selective reading and misinterpretation. People tend to focus on those areas of uncertainty, and they tend to miss the nuance of the arguments. Most minds aren't trained in scientific method, and so it's a little beyond their ability to reason to that. We've also found that people's core positions on morality and the ordering of society strongly predict what they will consider a legitimate source. Morality and the ordering of society, how they see the world, predicts what they will see as a legitimate source. And so this takes up work that was done by Dan Kahan out of Yale Law School. And he grouped people together and wanted to kind of put them into categories so that they'd be easier to deal with. And this is painting with a pretty broad brush, but I think it's pretty instructive. And so he saw people as either being individualistic or communitarians. That was, they tend to either assert their individual rights and see that the rights of the individual rises above the rights of the community, or they tended to be communitarians, where the need of the community was placed above the right of the individual, and it is the community that is primary and that comes first. And then the other division that he used was hierarchical or egalitarian. And so hierarchical likes their structure and their order, and any egalitarian wants to see any divisions and distinctions removed and see everybody on the same level, rather than in this hierarchical structure, like you might find in a corporate setting where you have the president and managers and then the workers. And so to kind of label it broadly and very quickly, and in some ways this does a little bit of a disservice, but he saw liberal Democrats as communitarian and egalitarian, and extremely conservative Republicans as individualistic and hierarchical. Now, the hierarchical individualists they tend to find commerce and industry and gun rights. These are the things that are important to them. These are the things that they strongly believe in. They believe this is what is going to save us as a society, right? Our ability to produce stuff, the ability to sell and trade that, the free markets that exist, the ability of individuals to protect themselves. These are all very important. For an egalitarian individualist, though, they see all of those things as threatening, right? Free markets can be very, very threatening and not entirely fair to everyone involved in the economy. They see patriarchal families as a threat. They look for that communitarian, that leveling of the playing fields, that egalitarian leveling of the playing fields. And they see guns as a negative influence on society. But see, none of this is neither of these groups are anti-science. If you ask these groups, they would both say that they adhere to a scientific philosophy. The question becomes then, what is science? And it is, for these groups, whatever they want it to be. Right? Their thinking and the importance they place on individualism and on the free market and on the economy or on the community and on the committing to stewardship of the community and its resources, that's going to change on what they see as legitimate science. What this ends up meaning is that evidence and argumentation are not enough to persuade people. When you confront people with an argument, and even when you confront them with evidence, one of two things will happen, maybe both. They will either come up with counter-arguments and work their way around them, or they are simply unmovable. They just will not change their beliefs, even in the face of a good, strong, logical argument, even in the face of convincing evidence. They will hold on to their beliefs no matter what. And so the question then becomes, how rational is this? How rational is it to hold on to beliefs in the face of contradicting information, contradicting data, and in the face of long, well thought out, logical arguments? Well, the author says, when we look at this, it doesn't make sense for a person to abandon a complete thought system that has been created over a lifetime based on one fact. It doesn't make sense to just completely walk away from that based on just the easy presentation of new information. It took a long period of time to gather that information and build that up, and people don't give that up easily. And so in some ways, we see this refusal to change their mind, this anti-science movement, if you will, in some ways is actually rather rational, because it is hanging on to this system that has been constructed over time. Another factor that we find in this whole question of why there seems to be so much denial of science is social desirability. When we are talking to another individual, particularly in a group of people, there is a desire to fit in with that group. There is a desire to be liked and to be accepted by the individual that is presenting the information. And so that affects how we think as well. There was an interesting study that came out where some researchers presented some information that would around the question as to whether Barack Obama, former President Barack Obama, was a Muslim. And they presented evidence to the contrary for that. And when they came in and looked at these individuals, what they found was that if this information was presented by a African American individual, it was much more readily accepted than if it was presented by a white person. And that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but what was happening is they wanted to be liked by the African American individual that was presenting the information. They wanted to be accepted by them, and so they were more open to being open to his ideas. Whereas as members of a white society, and as members, as a member of the fellow society of the information who was presenting the counter information, they were more apt to be able to dismiss that because they already felt accepted by the white presenter than they did by the African American presenter. And so this tendency to want to be liked also plays into, and want to fit into the group, also plays into how we accept new information. Now this is really interesting because this is where this takes us into the media, because then that looks at the question of how do we get our media and where do we get our information from, and where do we seek out information to confirm our views. And so one of the things that immediately comes to mind when we think of this is we begin to look at our sources of how we get information. We get information very differently now than we did even 10 or 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Now most of our information to us comes to us off of the internet, through blogs, through websites, through Facebook, through Twitter. Even when we look at national news sources, it tends to be on cable TV, on very targeted sources like Fox News or CNN News or NPR. And in all those cases, what we find is that each one of those providers of news tends to tailor or limit their information to a like-minded and very targeted audience. They're not seeking to make converts. They are, if you will, preaching to the choir. And so what you find is that we are living in a world that is, we sometimes use the word an echo box or an echo chamber. All of the places that we go to look for information, if we're not careful, are just echoing back what we already believe and what we already think. The author referred to this as narrowcasting, that targeting the information at a very limited audience, and basically in some ways telling them what they want to hear, not challenging their thinking and not pressing them with new information. And this is becoming a serious problem. We see this, of course, with climate change. Climate change is very interesting because what did we find happening, that as the science gets clearer and clearer and clearer, when climate change first came out, they were saying it looks like that human activity is beginning to affect the climate, and that began rather that they weren't 100% certain, and they didn't have all the models in, and didn't have all the research done. But as time has gone on, and we've done much more modeling, and we've done a lot more research, and gathered evidence and data and hard facts to back this information up, what we find is that that the science becomes more convincing, the division between those who believe it is becoming greater. We're becoming more divided. Rather than finding that we're starting to all slide towards the middle and meet in the middle, we're becoming more divided as to those who believe it and those who don't believe it. The other interesting thing we find particularly with climate change, is that political interest or views, those who have strong political interest and views are more biased than those that don't. Those that come at it from a political standpoint tend to be harder to convince than those that have low or no political interest. And part of this is because they have more to lose. Their identity is tied up in their party, and they're tied up in their understanding of who they are, and to change their mind on something is fundamental, if you will, as climate change would threaten their identity within that group. As a liberal Democrat, if you were to suddenly start denying climate change, that would put you in conflict with your group. And as a conservative Republican, if you were suddenly to start accepting climate change, it would do the same as well. All of a sudden you would be threatened, your position in that group would be threatened. The other thing that we find is that the higher the level of education, the greater the level of science denial. I found that amazing. That the more educated a person is, the more likely they are to deny the science of climate change. And part of the reasoning is because those who are able to, those who have higher levels of education are able to construct better counter-arguments, and they're better able to reanalyze the data and to come to new conclusions, but conclusions that fit their perceptions, that fit their thoughts. So the question then becomes, if we look at climate change, that's kind of an issue that we see the denial on the right side of the political spectrum, if you will. What about the left side of the political spectrum? Is there any place where we see that, you know, liberals, if we can label them that way, that they engage in science denial? And interestingly enough, there is, and that falls under the area of vaccine denial. Not wanting to get children vaccinated, having a fear of vaccine, feeling like the vaccines are just being pressed upon us by the medical community and are put out there by the drug companies. And this is very interesting because in many ways it parallels climate change. There are websites that you can go to gather this information, and YouTube videos that will talk about the dangers of vaccines and present hard evidence for the negative effects of vaccines. And this is despite the fact that the original study that started this whole furor has been withdrawn and proven false numerous times. And also is despite the fact that the chemical that has been suspected in causing the problems with the vaccines, the thimerosal, this mercury-based chemical, has been removed for quite a while now. And yet we still see this vaccine denial going on, this anti-vaxxer campaign, if you will. And so there is, on both the left and the right, there is this sense of science denial that goes on, this challenging of the scientific fact. What we do know, though, is that the science denial is more prominent on the political right. And we find that to be for some psychologists have looked at this, and they see some psychological differences between the left and the right that kind of cause this to occur. The right tends to be much more rigid and authoritarian in their way of thinking. And so any challenges to their presumed way of thinking is more threatening to them, whereas the left tends to be much more tolerant of ambiguity. If you think about this, the right tends to talk in terms of black and white about every moral issue, about every science issue. The left tends to be able to live more in an ambiguous world where things aren't so black and white, but they are much more gray. And there's those nuances that needed to be teased out, and the left seems to be able to do that better and is more comfortable doing that. The right is also system justifiers. They like to exist within the systems that they have created, whether they're economic, whether they're political, whether they're moral systems, and they will do whatever it takes to justify those and protect those. And we get back again, kind of coming back full circle to where we started, to that's just motivated reasoning, right, to defend the status quo. This is where you get into not so much reasoning as more maybe rationalizing. So we've kind of taken this little tour and established the fact that we all have biases. And so the question then becomes, how do we get around this? This is a serious problem, right? New information is being released all the time. We're being faced with new threats. The vast majority of the scientific community is telling us that climate change is real and needs to be confronted, and yet we have people who are denying it. And so what do we do about that? How do we handle that? And one of the things that the author points out is we need to learn to present information in a way that does not trigger emotional responses. As we have said, our emotions are the more primitive of the two between your emotions and logic and reasoning, and they tend to be the first to fire. And so we have to make sure and work very carefully that when we present new information and present arguments, that we don't present it in such a way that it triggers an emotional response. We have to get past that initial emotional reaction and allow the reasoning and the intellect to kick in. Interestingly enough, conservatives in this area will tend to trust business or religious leaders more than other individuals, more than scientists, and definitely more than politicians in this area. And so they seem to be able to get a little better past that emotional side and go straight to the logic and reasoning. So there might be a window of opportunity and a window of hope there. And the other suggestion that is made is that when you're dealing with someone who is in science denial, that you lead, well, don't lead with facts, but lead with figures, lead with emotion, excuse me, not emotions. Don't lead with emotions. Don't lead with facts. You want to lead with where you want them to go. You want to find those common values that you can get to, and lead with the values, and then bring the facts in as they begin to see the value, if you will, of where you're trying to take them. The facts are threatening. If you can find a way to make the values work for them and to play into their system and not threaten their thought system, then they become more open to that. Very interesting take on things. It's very, even though this article was written almost 7 years ago, and Festinger's research is almost 60, 70 years old, it's very interesting that this is something that we're still dealing with now. And I love the way he, in the end, presented some suggestions and some solutions as how we can work through that. I thank you for your time. You have a great evening.